Hello everyone, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar, Breakthrough Project Accounting for Microsoft Dynamics GP. We appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule to join us today. There are a couple of housekeeping items I'd like to mention before we begin. All attendees are in listen-only mode. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please either raise your hand and I'll unmute your line so you can ask your question directly, or submit them through the GoToWebinar question box. We'll be saving questions until the end of the presentation today to make sure we get through all of the material. And we'll also follow up afterwards if you have any additional questions. I'd like to introduce today's speaker. We have Penny Compton, who's a senior GP consultant here at Socius. Penny's responsible for supporting Socius's Dynamics GP clients. She's well versed in the core modules of the Dynamics GP, including project, accounting, and contract administration. She's been involved as the project lead consultant, in over 8 project accounting implementations. So at this point, Penny, I believe we're ready to transition over to you to begin.
All right. Well, happy afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our presentation. And as we start our presentation, I wanted to kind of give a little economic history. So the chart, the pyramid that we have in front of us, represents the economy of a growing nation or a growing country. And as we are, as economists are looking through history, they have found that each of these, economies, they grow in the same manner. They start here at our primary sector, which is the bottom portion, and that is the agriculture. It's a heavy reliance on, farming and mining and the production of basic goods. Raw materials, corn, coal, wheat, iron, that sort of thing. And then as that economy matures, it moves into our secondary sector, which is the production of goods or manufacturing. And then as the country or the economy continues to mature and it requires less effort to produce those goods, that economy then moves into that tertiary or that third sector, which is the services sector. And in that services sector, companies primarily earn their revenue through providing intangible products and services. And those intangible products are activities where people offer their knowledge and time to improve productivity, performance, potential, and sustainability. Companies earn their revenue based on subject matter experts, based on the thoughts of their employees. And so as we look further at the U.S. specifically, professional services in the early 20th century, there were only about 30% of total, workers in the U.S. were in the service industry. And then as we moved to the mid-20th century, that number grew to about 50%. And then as we look at our current time frame, early 21st century, that number is close to 80%. So 80% of the people in the U.S. that are working are being paid because they're a subject matter expert. They are, producing those intangible, thoughts and ideas. That commodity traded is knowledge. And I was looking at the U.S. Department of Labor website, and I found an article that had the following comment. The service providing sectors are projected to account for more than 90% of the jobs that will be added to the economy between 2012 and 2020. So out of all the jobs that are being created in this 10-year time frame, 90% of those are consultants, are service providers, people who are being paid based on their expertise. And so from a U.S. standpoint, that's where we're at. We are a service-based economy now. And with that evolution and that trend towards moving to service-based, there's also a need for the accounting system to be able to support those service-based businesses. Traditional accounting methods don't quite provide the level of detail that those businesses are needing. And so to address that, Dynamics GP offers the project accounting module. And so why would you need to use a project accounting solution? If your traditional data, accounting data and measurements are not enough to aid your decision makers. Projects and service-based businesses, they want to look at their projects, they tend to want to look at their projects in pieces. And a traditional accounting is not quite giving them that level of detail. For service-based business, people costs are typically the highest cost that they have. And again, traditional accounting doesn't quite give you that level of information. Or, if your tracking time and expense is required to substantiate the efforts for your clients, you may need a project accounting solution. In this example, if you're charging a client $5,000, and in order to, and the client asks you to support that, if, telling them that, employee number A spent 30 hours developing, this program for them is your support, that's part of the, functionality that a project accounting system can give you. And then finally, if you need to measure or track data in multiple points, your overall deliverable, your project may have 4 or 5 sub-pieces to it. And if you need to be able to provide data at those sub-levels, a project accounting solution can help you with that. So now that we've kind of defined what a project accounting solution is and why we would need that, let's dig into what it is project accounting in Dynamics GP can do for us. So as we are, looking at project accounting, our first level is our contract. And our contract is, I like to think of it as the 50,000-foot level. This is the overall statement of work, the master agreement with that client. And then underneath that, I can have projects. And I can have as many or as few projects under that contract as I want. And a project is typically an individual deliverable or a phase of that overall master agreement. Underneath that project are cost groups. Cost groups are groupings of costs that make up, or that are provided or utilized for delivering that project. And I can have as many or as few cost groups under my project as I need. For example, if some clients want a cost group called travel. Any travel expenses goes to that one group. Whether, regardless of what type of expense it is. Other clients may want to look at their travel in a little more granular nature. So they would create a cost group for airfare, lodging, auto, meals. And then as they are recording those costs, they would put the appropriate cost in the appropriate bucket. The more granular that you set your buckets, detail you can get out of your project accounting system. So from a basic standpoint, project accounting gives us these 3 levels. But as we are going through those levels, we can see I can apply so much more to my project than those 3 levels. So here I've got my contract maintenance window. And in this window, this is my 50,000 foot level, I can assign a customer. Typically, this is the customer who owns this agreement. It can or cannot, it can be the company that you're billing, but it doesn't have to be. On this contract, I can assign a contract ID and a description. I can assign a class ID. And typically, this class ID is used as a classification for this contract. So if I wanted to, from let's say a reporting standpoint, group like contracts together, I can use my class ID to do that. I can assign contract managers and business managers to my contract. And these would be the people who are responsible for the overall master service that is being provided. And I can use this, for subgrouping in reporting and or as I'm looking at the data in my project. Who should I go to if I have questions? That would be my contract manager or my business manager. There are other areas of this contract that we can provide. There are user-defined fields, setting fields, and things like that we can do. I'm just highlighting a few here. But I can provide additional characteristics in my contract window that give me layers of data to help as I am providing that information to my managers and executives and decision makers. As I move into the project level, at the project level, I can assign a project number and a description. What is this project that I am working on, this sub-deliverable? And I can provide that ID and that description. I can designate what type of project it is. Within Dynamics GP, I can have fixed price projects, which means that I have, I have sold this agreement to the client. I'm going to bill them a flat amount, no more, no less. That's the amount I'm going to bill. I can have time and material projects where my revenue is based on a unit price. Typically, for time and materials, labor is a key unit for us that we would use, and so I would set maybe an hourly rate. Every unit of every hour, I would get to bill a certain amount. I can also do cost plus, which allows me to set my revenue as a percentage of what my expected costs are. In my project, I can set my accounting method on how I want to recognize the revenue and cost on that project. I can set posting overrides. In my example here, my GL account structure has 2 segments, my main account and a department. At my project level, I can designate that this specific project is going to always be posted to department number 01. And I can set these designations on an individual project level. So if my overall contract has 3 or 4 projects, project 1 can go to department 1 and be fixed price, but maybe project 2 is time and materials and it goes to department 3. On my project level, I also have a class ID field, and again, this is used for subclassifying my projects. I think again, from a reporting standpoint, I can group like projects together. I can assign project managers, business managers, estimators. These are the employees or people who are responsible for this subphase of my overall deliverable. I can assign a purchase order for this particular piece of my project. If sometimes we find clients, they sign an overall master agreement that covers, a scope of work, but then they end up issuing individual purchase orders for each piece. And so from my project window, I can assign a purchase order for this piece of the overall project or scope of work. Once I have set my project up, I can then move into my costs. And the costs are the groups, or my costs are grouped into cost categories. So in my example, I have very basic cost categories: labor, vendors, employee expenses. I could make this as granular as I wanted. If I wanted to group my labor and have maybe 3 or 4 labor categories based on the type of labor or the type of employee, I can do that. If I want to break down my costs, like I mentioned earlier, instead of having a generic group called travel, I could have individual groups called airfare, lodging, meals, transportation. It really depends on how you as a business want to look at your costs. What is that detail level that you and your decision makers need to run your business? Once I've established what my categories are, I can then assign a budget. And I can budget my revenue, I can budget my cost, and I can budget my quantity. What do I expect to earn, and what cost do I expect to incur for this project? And this is beneficial later on when I want to do analysis. If I have a budget, I can compare that budget to what really happened to see, I thought this was going to take me 75 hours of labor, and it was going to cost me, $35 an hour. What did it really cost me? And so then, if my project, took longer than I expected, I have some data that help me understand or to pinpoint where I went off the plan for. Was it in labor? Was it in vendor costs? Was it on travel? Where did I get off of my plan? Or at the same time, if I did better than I thought, where was that savings at? And is it because I didn't complete a step in that I was supposed to complete, or was my estimate off? So by tracking at this level of detail and by having these budgets, I'm able to answer some of those questions to help make better decisions for my business. Now that I have my project set up, now I can start posting transactions to that project. And for service-based businesses, people costs are typically the highest grouping of costs that they would have. And so project accounting allows me to enter timesheets and employee expense reports at that employee level so that I can see that, in this case, my employee, Barbara Gordon, worked 8 hours on my project this week. And I can add, in my transaction here, I can add billing notes so that I can have, Barbara tell me, what exactly did she do this week? You spent 2 hours on, or 4 hours on Monday. What is it that you did? And that will help me as I am looking at my project to determine where I'm at, what I'm doing, and how efficient that I'm being. Same thing with expenses. I can code my expenses to that. With Dynamics GP 2015, we also have added workflow functionality. And with that workflow functionality, I can build in an approval workflow so that when I submit my timesheet, that timesheet can go to Barbara's manager or a designated person who is supposed to review that. Or if I submit an expense report, maybe it has to go to a person to review that to make sure that that is a legitimate expense. I can build that into Dynamics GP using the workflow functionality, and then I can also build in an email so that that person, whoever is responsible for that next step in that process, can get a workflow notifying them, or can get an email notifying them that they have a step to complete. In this case, this was a timesheet approval email, and so it was sent to me telling me that Barbara Gordon had submitted a timesheet. It gives me a little bit of the detail from that timesheet, and it gives me a link that I can, assuming I have the correct setup in Dynamics GP, I could link back and approve that email directly from this email, or approve that timesheet directly from this email. I can also enter vendor transactions against my project. So if I do need to purchase items for this project, I can enter those through my purchasing receiving transaction entry window and tag those costs directly to my project. I can enter equipment log transactions. So for example, if part of my overall project included making copies of documents, I could allocate through an equipment log cost for the usage of that copier. And I can make that transaction be based on the number of copies. It could be based on hours used. It could be based on days. Whatever level that I would need it, I can build that functionality in so that I can allocate the cost for using that copier into my project if I wanted to. I can make inventory transfers. So if I am using the inventory module in Dynamics GP and I have an item that I am using as part of my project, I can take that item out of inventory and assign that cost to my project. I worked with a client once who they taught classes. That was their service. But as part of that, they had textbooks. And so they would print, in large volumes, these textbooks. They carried them in their inventory in Dynamics GP. And then as they had clients set up for these training classes, they would allocate those textbooks to their project so that they could get an overall picture of what the cost of their service was. And finally, I can record miscellaneous logs. And I like to think of miscellaneous logs as my project accounting journal entries. If I need to record a cost against my project and it's not timesheet or expense report or vendor payables, it doesn't quite fit in one of those other transaction types, miscellaneous log is the transaction I would use to record that. In my example here, I've got a rent allocation. Under here is the type of transaction that I'm making. So in my example, the client wants to allocate a portion of their overall company rent to their projects. I have seen other clients who use this for corporate overhead. They don't necessarily want managers and their executives to post time against their projects, but they want the projects to record a piece of the cost of having those people overseeing the process. And so they would use a miscellaneous log to make that labor allocation. And again, I can set that up to be based on number of hours, a flat, daily rate, or a flat just everybody gets $500 to cover management fees. I can really set this up to handle the cost as the business needs them to be allocated. We spoke about workflow. And in project accounting, in starting with, with GP 2015, I have expense report approval workflow and timesheet approval workflow for project accounting. And underneath each of those workflows, I can build steps. And in my example here, I only have one step, but I could have multiple steps if I needed it to fit my business practice. In my step here, I have just got a manager approval. And I have assigned a specific person. So in my example, every timesheet that gets entered is going to go to Penny Thompson for approval. I could build my step to go to the manager. So instead of naming a specific person, I could tell it to go to that person's manager. Or in the case of maybe an expense report, I could build multiple steps into my workflow so that if an expense is over a certain amount, it has to go to a secondary approver before it can be paid and reimbursement given to that employee. So with this workflow functionality, I can build that to fit the needs of my project and in my business. I also have the ability to create invoicing out of project accounting. And when I create my invoice in project accounting, it has a link into my receivables management module so that my invoice will appear in that module. It will show up on my aging. I can receive cash in the standard, in my standard processes through my receivables module. But the actual invoice is created in project accounting. One of the things that project accounting does is it separates invoicing from revenue recognition. And so I have the ability to recognize revenue under one schedule and create the invoicing to the client in the next schedule. And project accounting will keep track of what I've recognized and what I've billed or not billed for me. So I don't ever have to worry about forgetting to bill something because project accounting is going to remember and keep track of that for me. So in my project accounting module, I can open up the billing window, select my projects and my client, create my invoice, and then I can produce an invoice that I would send to my client. And I can produce these invoices at whatever level I would like them to be. I can bill at the contract level. Maybe my client doesn't want to see all the detail, so I can create my invoice to bill at that contract level so they get one lump sum that says, hey, please pay me $5,000. I can create my invoice to bill at the project level. That's sub-deliverable. And then in that case, my invoice, I may have 4 or 5 lines, and it will show me, totals for each of my individual projects. I can bill at the cost category level, my cost groups. If I wanted to bill and show that level of detail to my client, I could build my invoice template to bill at that transaction or that cost grouping level. And finally, if I wanted to, I could bill at the individual transaction level if I wanted to show that to my clients. So now that I have my data in my project, now I can start talking about reporting, business intelligence. How can I get the data out so that my decision makers can make informed and timely decisions for my business? And one of my favorite reporting tools is SmartList Designer or SmartList Builder if you own that third-party product. For me, that's the best way to get information out of project accounting. And so here I've got a report that is a variance report. It's comparing my expected cost to my actual cost. So in my report, I've got my budgeted cost or my expected cost. I've got a column here for actual cost. So this would be costs that if it came through a vendor, I have received the invoice, or the timesheet from the employee has been processed, or the expense report, or the equipment log. Actual transactions have been posted within GP against my project for these costs. So those are my actual costs. Next, I have committed costs. And for project accounting, my committed costs are those costs that I have agreed to, but for whatever reason, I haven't actually gotten an actual invoice for them yet. So in my example here, I've got committed purchase order costs and issued purchase order costs. And within project accounting, I'm able to designate and break down the costs that I have on purchase order. Committed purchase order costs are costs where I have issued a purchase order. There have been some partial receivers against those purchase orders, but not everything has been cleared. And in that case, my designation represents, for me, a timing. I received partial items on this purchase order, so I expect the rest of those and the rest of that purchase order to be cleared in a fairly short-term time frame. On the other hand, I've got issued PO costs. Those PO costs are purchase orders that I have issued, but nothing has been processed against those purchase orders. And for me, in this report, that represents more of a long-term cost. I've submitted that purchase order to the vendor, but I don't expect those costs to come in and a date further out. I've committed to them. I just think they're going to happen in a longer time frame than the committed cost. On my report then, I've got a total, so it's just the sum of those two columns. So here are my commitments. Regardless of where it's at in the process, I have purchase orders outstanding for these totals. And then finally, I have uncommitted cost as complete. And what this is this is my variance column. It takes my budgeted cost minus my actual cost minus my total commitments, and it gives me here's where I think I'm going to be based on what I know right now on my project. And you'll notice some of those variances are negative, some of them are positive. My very first project there, I expected to spend or incur $875 of cost. So far, I have incurred $1,418.50. So I've gone over my budget. As a project manager, I would care about that, or a business decision maker. That project, just based on my negative cost, tells me something has not gone as planned, and I need to investigate that. And I can get all of that information from my Smart List report. But I can go further than that. If I create a reminder on my home page, I can help alert people to when those projects first go negative or first have whatever my criteria happen to them. I can have that alert my user based on this reminder on their home page. So for this reminder that I have here, I set it to use that Smart List that I built, and then I added the criteria that said, remind me of projects who have a negative variance, who have gone over budget. And so my reminder here tells me I have 5 projects who have gone over budget. Those are the 5 projects I want to investigate. And so I could click on that link and it would open my spreadsheet and tell me the names of those 5 projects. If I built in maybe my business manager or my project manager, those extra fields of data that I supplied when I set up my project, that Smart List report could tell me exactly who I need to go ask questions of so that I can make the decisions needed against that project. Another example of a Smart List report that I've created is my work in process, my WIP report. And this one specifically is based on time and material projects. But if you remember, when we were looking at our billing and our invoice, I had told you that project accounting separates the timing of when I bill and the timing of when I recognize my revenue. And so with this report, I can see what I have recognized but not billed. So when I look at this project, my very first project in my list here, I can see that I have $2,275 of revenue that I have earned, but I have not billed the client yet. I could use this as a billing report if that fit my business process to say I need to go bill that client. Or I could use it just as a knowledge of what my future billings are for maybe a cash flow perspective. If I exported this Smart List to Excel and I totaled that column, I should have on my balance sheet an asset for the total of that column of all unbilled revenue. As part of project accounting, it's going to record as an asset on my balance sheet how much I have recognized but not billed. And I can use this report to support that GL account balance. If I move further, I can utilize project accounting for employee utilization. And what I have here are examples of KPIs. And you can produce these using SQL reporting services or BI 360 or reporting packages that are out there. I can create these charts and graphs that allow me to highlight certain key performance indicators. So in our example here, the first one just provides an annual goal. It's kind of an odometer type of graph that shows where this person is compared to their overall goal. The second one is a pie chart that just breaks down their client billable time versus their administrative time to help them kind of visually see what their breakdown of hours are. And then our third one here highlights kind of a month to month how that person did compared to their overall goal, and then kind of gives your red light, green light, and your up and down arrow to give a visual indication of how they are doing compared to that goal. But all of the information that is behind this comes from project accounting and those transactions that I am posting to my project. And then finally, I can, on my home page, take advantage of the Business Analyzer content area to show some of those charts and graphs and reports, so that, if I have, in this case, I'm looking at Business Analyzer on my GP homepage, I can have, as my user logs in, they can see some of these performance indicators on their homepage. Microsoft offers, with Dynamics GP, they offer a few standard charts and graphs in their Business Analyzer for you. So the top projects over budget, that graph comes with Dynamics GP. That is not something that I created specifically for my presentation. That was an out-of-the-box graphic provided by Microsoft with Dynamics GP. But I have the ability, if I wanted to create a graph or a key performance indicator that was very specific to my business, I could add it so that it could appear in this window. We also have the Business Analyzer functionality that allows you to see reports and graphs and charts outside of GP. So I could launch that Business Analyzer functionality, bring in my charts and graphs, and allow, let's say, executives who are not logging into GP, but still give them access to this data. Or I could build reports through a reporting service and allow them to see data that way. There are also, out of the box, some SQL reporting services and Excel reports that are available, provided by Microsoft with your Dynamics GP, that you can utilize to have access to your data. So getting the data, once I build my project and I establish what the various projects and cost groupings and what detail level that I need to run my business, I can then create reports and graphs and whatever information I need, analytics, in order to provide that information to my decision makers at that level of detail that my business needs. And that's the last slide that I had.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Penny. I just had to unmute myself there. We do have some questions that have come in, and to remind everyone, if you'd like to submit a question, you can either raise your hand and we'll unmute your line to ask to Penny directly, or type it into the question box. And there are a few things that we wanted to highlight on the screen showing now. Our next monthly user webinar will be on March 10th, covering smart lists for data analysis. And we're also excited to announce that our annual GP and CRM customer event will be hosted in 3 locations this year: Columbus on May 5th, Charlotte on May 10th, and Atlanta on May 12th. So to find more information about the tips and tricks and the teams you'll get in front of and networking with users and everything, visit socius1.com/aspire. And that has all that information as well as the registration link. And then we have some promotions listed as well that we have on our site at socius1.com/promotions. It includes the Mikurma multi-batch print and post and then a scribe promotion for those softwares. So Penny, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that came in here.
Okay.
This one says, assume you are not using external timesheet tool. To use workflow approvals on timesheet, are you saying works with third-party timesheet tool? Are you entering time directly into GP timesheet to use functionality?
So timesheet functionality, I have clients who do use third-party tools, and then you also have clients who utilize the GP timesheet tools. And so if you're using a third party, it really depends on that third party, whether or not their timesheets feed directly into Dynamics GP, or whether or not you would need to build a data integration to connect the two pieces together. Some third parties build in that integration so that when you're in that third party and you hit post, it automatically pushes that data into Dynamics GP. Other third parties, they collect the data. You would then, create an integration using a tool like maybe Scribe or eConnect, or even, maybe an integration manager, that you would then take that data from that third-party timesheet and bring that into Dynamics GP. Out of the box, GP, starting with 2015, offers functionality for your users to enter their timesheets. And kind of there are several ways we can set that up. Ideally, the thought was you would use the GP web client. Your users, your timesheet staff would log into the GP web client. They would open a timesheet window, enter their timesheet, and submit that. With that, so they are logging into GP to enter their timesheet. With that functionality, Microsoft has released what is called an ESS, or Employee Self-Service User. That user has limited functionality that only lets them, in this case, enter timesheets or expense reports against project accounting. There is very limited functionality, so that person could never, if they were tagged as an ESS or a self-service employee, they could never, even if you gave them a security role of power user, they would never be able to make a journal entry or enter any kind of transactions. And Microsoft has built that user just for allowing the employees to log in through that web client and enter in their timesheets. And the cost of those ESS users are quite a bit lower than a standard full user. But that's how out of the box you would use that web client, and your employees would log into the web client and enter their timesheets.
Okay, here's another question. Can you give an example of what the cost category level billing looks like on an invoice?
So if we were billing at the cost category, I would go back to my travel example. If I created cost groupings for the various travel, airfare, lodging, meals, and I wanted to create an invoice at that cost category level, what I would see on my invoice is a line called airfare, and then a dollar amount, and then a line for lodging and a dollar amount, and a line for, auto and a dollar amount. That's the cost category level, so I'm not looking at individual transactions. So I'm not seeing that Penny Compton submitted an expense report for $25. I'm just seeing a kind of a lump sum that says, for auto expenses, here's the total that I want to bill. And as I'm building my invoice, I don't necessarily just have to show auto because that's the name of my category. I can actually put, more of a descriptor that appears on my invoice, even though behind the scenes that description correlates to my auto category.
So a couple more questions. We budget by labor level by week across life of project as defined in Gantt. How can I do that without spreading costs equally over entry period?
So from a Dynamics GP standpoint, I can spread my budget based on my fiscal periods. So if my total labor for my project was 75 hours, total of $5,000, I can enter that as a lump sum, or I can spread that across my accounting periods, my fiscal periods. So in order to, within standard functionality within GP, in order to spread that weekly, I can, I could set up my fiscal periods to be weekly, or depending on the business needs for your project, we may need to set up maybe cost categories that represent each individual week. So there are several ways we could do that. It really would, we would need to know more detail about your business and how that project works and the flow of the data in order to best determine how to set your project up. There are project templates, so I don't want anyone to think, if I set up 52 cost categories that represent my 52 weeks of the year, that I would have to manually do a lot of data entry. There are templates in project accounting where I can set up my shell contract and my shell project. And so I typically say, in the template, it's that 80-20 rule. I can set up 80% of the structure of my project in my template, and then when I create a new project using that template, I just have to fill in the remaining 20%. But that's how, not really knowing a lot about the, the business behind that question. There are a couple ways we could set them up. We would just really need to delve into that further.
Okay. If you're using payroll in GP and have an employee work on several projects, how does GP allocate the taxes and benefits to each project? Basic, the overall taxes like FUTA, SUTA, and workers' comp cost.
So when we are using, employee labor, Dynamics GP, you would establish on your project or on your employee card, you would create an employee in your payroll system, and then you can use actual pay codes, and then you can apply an overhead rate. So if I'm, setting up an employee for project accounting, I would tell it, here's my pay code where you're going to find my base wages, and then you're going to apply an overhead rate. And that rate is, let's say it's 25%. It's the rate that we're going to use. When I charge time to my project, it's going to take my base salary, add 25% of that base salary to my or my base hourly rate, take 25% of that base hourly rate, and that's the cost per hour that's going to hit my project. So it's not exactly an actual allocation of your taxes that are paid. It is an estimated based on that overhead rate that I'm applying.
Okay. Ernie had a note, typically called blended rate of all the taxes.
Right, right. So as I'm calculating that overhead rate, I would take into account the taxes and the fees that I wanted to allocate as part of my project and use that to come up with that percentage so that I end up with a blended rate. If I'm not using payroll, I can come up with a rate that, maybe it's the same rate across a whole department. So I'm not looking at any one individual's rate, but let's say it's consulting services is my department. I can come up with a blended rate that represents all salaries for that department and all of the overhead that that department incurs, and come up with an average or a blended rate, and I can use that for my project.
Let's see, he also noted typically adjusted at year end or quarter.
Right.
Let's see. That's all the questions that I have in the box for now. We do have 2 more minutes until 2 o'clock, so Penny and I will stay on the line for a couple more minutes. Penny, if you want to advance to the next slide with your contact information.
Sure.
So this is Penny's direct contact information, phone and email address. If you do have any questions you think of after the presentation, you're welcome to contact her directly. And we did record today's presentation, so we'll be sending that out afterwards, as well as a copy of the slide deck in case you would like to share with anyone on your team. So for those of you that do want to jump off, we appreciate your time and thanks for joining us today.